The year is 2002. We've just loaded up Battlefield 1942 and we're running around the original Wake Island map, and it's epic. Who would have thought that in 2019 and 10 Battlefield games later we would be playing a new version of the map and it would look as good as it does. I can't think of any other Battlefield map that has featured in as many Battlefield titles as Wake Island. That should tell you how well loved it is, and it's changed a lot in more recent versions of the map. In this video we're diving into how the map has changed and evolved over the years, and a big thanks to EA for sponsoring. So Wake Island featured in Battlefield 1942, Vietnam, BF2, BF2142, which I honestly didn't even remember until I looked it up, then Battlefield Heroes, BF1943, Online, BF3 and Battlefield 5. Now that's a whole lot of Battlefield games, and I thought it would be really cool to see exactly how the map has evolved over the years as the games have changed. So I've gone into the main title Battlefield games that the map has featured in. We have to remember that Battlefield 1942 came out almost 20 years ago, so considering how old it was, it still looked great. Of course, the level itself was pretty basic. Most of the flags had a few simple buildings. The main C flag had the iconic airstrip, of course, and the overall map itself is quite flat. There isn't a whole lot of natural cover here either, like there is in the more modern versions, because back then the geometry of those levels and what systems were capable of was much lower down the scale. Then the Battlefield 2 version comes along. Now the main thing to remember with BF2 is that it's a modern setting, whereas Wake Island is of course famous originally from the battle that went down there in World War II. Despite that, the map is very similar to the original with not a whole lot of changes. The main thing you will notice is a few more modern structures here and there, like modern radio towers and of course helicopter landing pads, because BF2 had helicopters. The other thing you will notice with the BF2 version is the amount of detail. There is a definite step up when it comes to texture detail and foliage on this map. There are way more buildings on the flags, so they feel a lot fuller. And the buildings that are there definitely have more detail on them. Over the rest of the map there are way more trees and general foliage that make it just feel a bit more alive and realistic. Of course, Battlefield 2 came out in 2005, so only 3 or so years after 1942, but it's interesting to see the improvements there. BF2 was also on a different version of the engine that powered the original game. 1942 was released on Refractor 1 and Battlefield 2 was on Refractor 2, no Frostbite just yet. The next game that I looked at was BF2142. And this is where the map starts to look really completely different. And well, I guess it would have to, right? 2142 is of course a game set way in the far future, as the name would suggest. So it would look pretty weird if it looked exactly the same as it did during World War II. And I'll be honest, I mentioned this earlier, I cannot remember actually playing Wake Island in BF2142. And I played a lot of that game, but I just don't recall playing it. I will say that most of the flags bear some resemblance to the original version though, apart from the C flag. The outer flags like BAE for instance all have the same overall structure as the 1942 and BF2 version, but with much more futuristic buildings. It's when you get to the C flag though that the map completely changes, with a massive area built up of structures. There are high walls all around, and the iconic airstrip, well, it's not there anymore because there aren't any planes to take off there. Instead, it's replaced with roads and tank spawns. Apparently that's needed in the future. There's also an extra flag in this area too. And if you head out towards the water, there's another flag on top of a Titan ship that is hovering above the ground. Over at the uppermost part of the map near A, there's also this huge bunker structure, way bigger than any of the structures in the other maps. And there is usually something over there. In 1942, it was a cannon. In BF2, it was a small bunker, but 2142 took that and scaled it up massively. What would be the US spawn on the other maps also happens to be a Titan, which is just cool. In fact, running around this map just made me think about how awesome a 2142 sequel would actually be nowadays with how far game technology has come. I for one would love that, but with DICE and EA already having the Star Wars franchise available to them, I don't think we'd see any sort of far future games from the Battlefield franchise anytime soon. It's still okay to dream a bit though, right? What 2142 offered was a realistic version of the future, and it seemed to fit nicely with Battlefield, perhaps a bit ahead of its time. The next game that I jumped into was BF 1943, and as you can imagine, this one is pretty similar to the original map, being set in the same era of time, of course. There are still people playing it, and you can jump on it on your Xbox One via backwards compatibility. And even in BF 1943 you can launch private games, and that's something I've noticed with all of the titles that I've shown so far. BF 1942, BF2 and 2142. I could still log into the game and make my own server in no time at all. It shows how much of a legacy staple that option is in the Battlefield franchise. Anyway, BF 1943, I have to admit it was a bit tougher to get some nice shots of this because although you could make a private server, you do need a minimum amount of players to join. So off to a live server I went. The map felt pretty similar to the original but with improved visuals throughout. The overall level of detail was of course significantly better, but it did come out 7 years later, so you would expect that. And 1943 was one of the first ever games to appear on Frostbite, in this case Frostbite 1.5. Now then, skip ahead to 2011, Battlefield 3. This is where the map starts to take a big detour in regards to its layout and design. Through all of the versions that we've looked at, despite having visual changes and improvements, overall, the layout has stayed roughly the same. Even the flags themselves had buildings in the same positions for the most part, to the point that most of the flags were recognisable through all of the different variations. When Battlefield 3 came around though, that changed. The whole terrain of the map was different and the aesthetic completely changed. None of the flags were really very much representative of their original versions. The concept of this map was pretty much the under construction feel, and of course with BF3 being set in a modern era, there was nothing wrong with the design of the map being different. Of course the layout of the overall map is the same in terms of where the flags are positioned, but the design of each flag was quite different. There were lots of construction vehicles around. Of course, we remembered the iconic digger that you could drive. More of that please, DICE. There were some really unique structures around, as well as hangars on the sea flag, for example, that made the map feel more realistic than ever. And this would be the second time, I suppose, that the map was on Frostbite. And I think you could definitely see the increase in visual fidelity. The detail of the terrain, the foliage, all of the buildings and the interiors, the water. I'm sure we all remember the first time that we saw the Battlefield 3 Fault Line demo and remember just how good it looked. And do you remember the top part of the A flag that I talked about earlier? Well, Battlefield 3 has a bunker in there too, and inside there's a little Easter egg. It's a radio that plays the 1942 theme song. A nice touch, and don't forget the plaque that was put there too, featuring our favourite dinosaur. Then it's time for the Battlefield 5 version, and before we get into the map itself, just check out this Google Map image of the real Wake Island, and then look exactly how accurate the Battlefield 5 version actually is in terms of the overall design and scale. It's seriously impressive. It's so accurate that when we unearthed the recent crab Easter egg, we were provided with Google Maps locations and we were able to go to that corresponding area in the map because the actual design is so damn close, we could use that for hints and find the things that we were looking for. Even in relation to some of the structures that were on the real Wake Island. Of course, we couldn't be further away now from the original map, but I personally think that the new version is a pretty good version of the map. Most flags still have their core identity, but visually, I do think it's the best version of the map so far. And one of the things that you really notice is how improved the terrain design is, even from Battlefield 3, but especially from the older games. The lighting we've got here, the detail. Honestly, when you just sit back and walk through the map, take it all in, that's when you truly appreciate how much time and effort has gone into this. And you just don't realize that sometimes when you're running around playing and all the noise and violence is going on. One of my favourite new features of the map that I don't think many people have realised yet is over at the D flag. If you come over here, you'll find bunkers full of ammunition. Now if you throw a grenade in there or any sort of explosives, something pretty big happens. A massive explosion that blows you backwards, and of course if there are any enemies nearby, it will kill them too. But are there even bigger explosions to find on this map? Maybe, just maybe. In conclusion, well, it's quite obvious. Wake Island is one of the most iconic Battlefield maps ever created. It has to be for it to have been remade this many times, but will we ever see Wake Island again? I hope so, don't you? And that's all for today, folks. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this one, leave a like. If you didn't, a dislike. Subscribe for more, and I'll see you in the next one.